Just for today,
So,
would
what
you
brings you
pretend to
here
be my
today?
son?
Just passing through.
An
This place has great
86-year-old woman
coffee.
said
It's
those
a local
words standing
favorite.
in front of 6 Hells Angels
We have to
bikers.
talk about
Her
this.
hands were
What is it?
shaking
You're
so hard she
scaring
could
me.
barely
We need
hold
to
her
leave.
purse.
Now.
Her voice broke on the last
No,
word.
Wolf, this is now!
Every fork in the diner stopped midair.
It's over!
Every
This
mouth went
means
silent.
nothing!
She had no children, no family left who would protect her. And the man who was supposed to love her was 13 minutes away, coming to take everything she had left. So she walked straight toward the most dangerous men in the room, and she asked them to be her family. This is the story of Willa Greer, and it begins the way most acts of courage begin. Not with a battle cry, not with a plan, but with a quiet morning, a cup of coffee, and a pair of hands that would not stop shaking. It was just past 6 in the morning when Willa Greer came downstairs. The kitchen was the same as it had been for 61 years. The same pine cabinets Earl had built by hand. The same cast iron skillet hanging on the same hook beside the stove. The same crack in the linoleum near the back door that she had been meaning to fix since 1987 and had long since stopped meaning to fix at all. Some things you stop trying to change. Some things you just learn to love the way they are. She filled the percolator. She set it on the burner. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard the way she did every morning, watching the light come up slow and gold over the mountains, watching the long row of pine trees along the east fence begin to separate themselves from the darkness, branch by branch becoming real again. Earl had planted those trees. He had planted them the first winter they lived in this house in 1963, when the Montana wind came roaring down off the Rockies like something alive and angry, and Willa had told him, only half joking, that she was never getting out of bed again until spring. He had laughed. He had put on his coat and his boots, and he had gone out into that frozen ground with a post-hole digger and a flat of seedlings he had driven 40 miles to buy, and he had planted every one of them himself, working until his hands were bleeding through his gloves, because Willa was cold, and Earl Greer did not know how to respond to a problem except by solving it. That was 59 years ago. Those trees were 40 feet tall now. They had outlived him. Most things had. Willa looked at her hands on the countertop. They were shaking. Not the gentle, papery tremor of old age that she had learned to live with over the last decade. Something different. Something that came from deeper down, from a place below the body, from the part of a person that knows danger before the mind has caught up to it. She turned to the shelf above the refrigerator. Earl's photograph was there where it had been since the week after his funeral. He was standing in the garden, squinting into the sun, holding a tomato in one hand and grinning like a man who had just won something. He looked ridiculous. He looked exactly like himself. Earl, she said to the photograph to the kitchen to the morning, I need to do something today that is either very brave or very stupid. I haven't decided which. The percolator began to bubble. The light kept coming up over the mountains. The pine trees stood where Earl had put them. She poured her coffee. She sat down at the table, and she waited for the day to begin. 3 weeks earlier, Willa Greer had been a woman who walked into Milford's Diner on Route 9 like she owned the place. That was how Betty Saylor had always thought of her. Not in an arrogant way, not in a way that took up space that didn't belong to her, just in the way of a person who had been somewhere long enough to know that they belonged there, who moved through a room without apology, who sat down and settled in and was simply fully present. Bet had been pouring coffee at Milford's for 10 years. She had started at 22, fresh off a Greyhound bus from Cheyenne, with $40 in her wallet and a very clear understanding that she needed to get as far away from her previous life as the $40 would allow. Milford's was where the bus stopped. The owner, a man named Leonard, who smelled like pipe tobacco and motor oil, had looked at her for about 4 seconds and said, the counter needs wiping and the coffee needs making, and you look like you know how to do both. She had. She still did. In 10 years, Bet had learned to read people the way some people read weather, by the way they held their shoulders, by the way they looked at the door when they walked in, whether they were checking who was there or checking for exits, by the way they stirred their coffee slow and thoughtful or fast and distracted, by the space between words when they ordered, which told you more than the words themselves. She knew Willa Greer well, had known her for most of those 10 years. Willa came in 4 mornings a week, always before 9, and always took the booth by the window on the east side of the diner, where the morning light came in straight and clean. She ordered Earl Grey tea hot and whatever the day's special was, and she ate alone and watched the parking lot and seemed perfectly content to do so. She was the kind of woman who made you sit up a little straighter without meaning to. 86 years old, silver hair, pinned back with two tortoiseshell clips, a wool cardigan in some shade of green or gray, no matter what season, and eyes that could cut through pretense like a blade through warm butter. 3 weeks ago, something had changed. Bet noticed it before she could have named it. Willa still came in at the same time, still sat at the same booth, still ordered the same tea, but the straightness had gone out of her spine just slightly, just enough to notice if you were looking for it. And she had started watching the parking lot differently, not the way she used to watch it with the easy attention of someone who simply liked to see the world going by. She watched it now the way you watch for something specific, something you are dreading. And then Preston Garvey had appeared. He had walked into Milford's on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago, and Bet had known immediately and instinctively that he was the kind of man who needed to be watched. Not because he looked dangerous, because he looked so very carefully like he didn't. 44 years old. Brown hair parted with precision. Khaki trousers pressed to a crease that could have cut glass. A pale blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to exactly the right point on the forearm. A leather folder tucked under one arm and a smile that had been practiced so many times it had become indistinguishable from a real one almost. He sat down across from Willa in the window booth. He set the leather folder on the table between them. He leaned forward and spoke in a voice too low for Bet to hear from across the diner, and Willa's shoulders dropped 2 inches in the first 30 seconds. Bet kept moving, kept refilling cups, kept wiping the counter, kept her eyes moving the way she had learned to do over a decade of watching a room. She noted the way Willa's hand hovered over the papers. Preston slid across the table, hovered and did not descend. The way Preston's practiced smile tightened at the edges when Willa pulled her hand back. The way he said as he stood to leave something that Bet caught only the end of. For your own good, Aunt Willa. And the way Willa sat for a long moment after he had gone, looking at nothing. That night, Bet had searched elder financial abuse on her phone and read until 2 in the morning. By the time she put it down, her hands were cold. The Tuesday that broke everything open was 6 days before the Thursday that changed everything. Preston had come back to Milford's, and this time he had brought his wife. Leanne Garvey was tall and fine-boned, with highlighted hair, and a way of carrying herself that communicated very clearly that she considered most rooms beneath her. She wore a ring on her right hand that cost more than Bet's car. She ordered nothing. Bet was restocking the condiment station behind the low partition at the back of the section. Close enough to hear. She had not planned to listen. She had not planned not to. She stopped moving the moment Leanne's voice rose above a murmur. The doctor's assessment has been filed. All we need is the signature on the power of attorney. Willa's voice came back thin. I don't understand why I need to sell my home. Preston's voice, gentle at the surface, steel an inch below. Because you can't take care of yourself, Aunt Willa. That's what the evaluation says. That's what the court will say if we have to go that route. But I feel fine, Willa said. Leanne cut in clean and final. The house is worth $1.4 million with the highway expansion. The window for this market won't stay open. You sign today, we handle everything, and you move somewhere safe. Betty's hand stopped moving entirely. $1.4 million. There it was, sitting on the table like something that had been there the whole time waiting for someone to turn the lights on. The appointment with the court is Monday, Preston continued. If you sign the power of attorney, now we do this quietly. If you don't, we file the competency petition and a judge decides. Either way, this is happening. There was a long silence. Then Willa spoke. And her voice was the saddest thing Bet had heard in 10 years of listening to people. Your mother was my sister, Willa said. She would never have done this to me. Preston's answer came without a pause. My mother isn't here, Aunt Willa. I am, and I'm trying to help you. Betty heard the folder close, heard the chairs push back, heard footsteps, and then she heard Willa crying. Not the loud breaking kind of grief, the quiet kind, the kind that comes from a person who has just understood fully and finally that they are alone. Bet stood behind that partition for 60 seconds. She was holding a bottle of ketchup and she did not know it. She did not sleep that night. She did not sleep the night after that. She kept turning it over. She was a waitress. She had no money, no connections, no power, no law degree. She knew what she had heard. She did not know what to do with what she had heard. And then Thursday came. There was something Bet had not told anyone even after 10 years. The first time Colt Maddox had walked into Milford's diner, she had gripped the edge of the counter with both hands and held on. 6 of them filing in through the front door, and the bell above it had sounded almost apologetic. Like even the hardware was aware it was announcing something larger than itself. The room had not gone quiet in any dramatic way. It had simply become more careful, more attentive, the way a field goes quiet when a hawk passes over. Colt Maddox was 57 years old, 6 feet of road-worn leather and gray threaded beard, with hands that looked like they had been through weather most people only saw in photographs. He had been riding with the chapter for over 30 years and running it for 12, and he had a way of occupying space that was not about aggression. It was about mass, about the simple physical reality that some things take up more room than others and do not apologize for it. The others came in behind him, Brick enormous and oddly graceful, the kind of man who moved carefully through the world because he had learned early that the world was not built to his scale. Deacon 63, the oldest of them, who kept a pair of reading glasses in his chest pocket and used them without any apparent self-consciousness. Tex 31, who made jokes that nobody laughed at and kept making them. Slade, lean and sharp-eyed, who noticed everything and said very little. Ridge, who almost never spoke at all except when something needed to be said, and who had embedded his observation a nearly perfect record of saying the right thing when he finally opened his mouth. They came every Thursday, same time, same booth, same order. 6 cups of black coffee, the breakfast plate, scrambled no toast for Colt, extra toast for Brick. They tipped 30% and never once caused trouble. And after 2 or 3 months, the rest of the regulars had simply absorbed them into the fabric of the diner the way you absorb any recurring fact about the world. They were there. They had always been there. They would be there next week. On the Thursday that changed everything, they came in at 11:15. Beatty brought the coffee. She set the cups down one at a time the way she always did, and she looked up and across the diner, and she saw Willa Greer sitting at the window booth with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone completely cold. Betty looked at Willa. She looked at the booth in the corner where Colt Maddox was reading the laminated menu he had memorized years ago. She looked at the clock above the pie case. 11:17. Preston Garvey had said noon. 43 minutes ago, before she had even thought this far, some part of Bet had already started doing the arithmetic. She told herself to wait. She told herself she did not know enough. She told herself she was a waitress, and this was not her business, and she should go refill the coffee at the counter and keep her eyes in her own lane. She refilled the coffee at the counter. She wiped down the pie case. She watched Willa. 23 minutes passed, and then Willa Greer did something that made every thought in Betty's head go perfectly, completely still. She stood up, not quickly, not with any drama. She stood up the way a person stands up when they have been sitting very still for a very long time, thinking something over, and they have finished thinking, and they have made a decision, and the decision has frightened them badly, and they are going to do it anyway. She smoothed the front of her gray cardigan. She picked up her purse, that old brown leather purse she had carried for as long as Betty had known her, and she held it against her chest with both hands. She looked across the diner. She began to walk, not toward the door, not toward the counter, toward the corner booth. Bet's hand stopped on the handle of the coffee pot. The 2 old farmers at the counter, Dale Pruitt and Hank Odom, who had been eating the same lunch at Milford's since approximately the Reagan administration stopped chewing. A young couple in the far booth looked up from their phones. Leonard came to stand in the kitchen window. An 86-year-old woman, 5 feet and 2 inches tall, wearing a gray wool cardigan and carrying a brown leather purse, was walking directly and deliberately towards 6 Hells Angels. Nobody moved. Willa reached the booth. She stood at the end of it. Colt looked up. Their eyes met, and Bet, watching from 15 feet away, saw something happen in that fraction of a second that she would spend a long time trying to describe and never quite manage to. Not recognition exactly. Not warmth, not yet. Something more fundamental than either. Like 2 compasses suddenly aware of the same north. Willa's hands tightened on the strap of her purse. Her chin lifted just slightly, the way a person lifts their chin when they are about to say something that costs them everything they have. Just for today, Willa Greer said, "Would you pretend to be my son?" The diner didn't just go quiet, it held its breath. Betty felt the back of her throat close. She didn't know why yet. Not fully. She only knew that she was watching something that would matter, that was already mattering, that had the weight of something real and rare and unrepeatable. Colt Maddox looked at Willa for a long time. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. Something deep, something that had been very still for a very long time and was only now beginning carefully to move. He said one word. Well, it was not cold. It was not dismissive. It was the voice of the man who needed to understand before he acted, who had learned the hard way that there were things you could not undo once they were in motion, and who was not willing to put anything in motion until he knew what he was dealing with. Willa's chin trembled. She held onto her purse like it was the only solid thing left in the room. My nephew is coming today, she said. He is going to make me sign papers that give him my house. The home my husband built with his own hands. The home I have lived in for 61 years. She paused, swallowed. He has a doctor who says I'm losing my mind. He has a court date set for Monday, and I have no children, no family left who will stand next to me and say that this woman is not alone. She looked at Colt, not around him, not at the table or her hands or the floor. Directly at him, into him. You are the most frightening man I have ever seen in my life, she said. And right now, that is exactly what I need. The booth was silent. Colt held Willa's gaze. 1 second. 2. Then he looked at his brothers and something passed between the 6 of them. No words. No signals that Betty could see. Just a current, something that moved through the air between them, like electricity through a circuit, a decision made in a language that existed only inside that particular brotherhood. Colt slid over in the booth. He placed his open hand on the vinyl seat beside him. What kind of son, he said slowly, lets his mother stand? Willa's knees buckled. Brick was out of his seat before she had gone an inch. He caught her elbow with a gentleness that seemed impossible coming from hands that size, steadied her, guided her into the booth beside Colt as carefully as you would handle something irreplaceable. Easy, Ma, Brick said. We got you. Willa sat. Her small frame against Colt's massive one should have looked absurd. It looked like the safest arrangement of bodies Bet had ever seen. Thank you, Willa whispered. Don't thank us yet, Colt said. He looked up at Bet, who was standing in the middle of the floor with a coffee pot she had completely forgotten she was holding. What does my mother like to eat? Betty blinked. She understood what was happening. She understood her role in it. Your mother, she said, and her voice was steady, which surprised her, loves lemon cake and Earl Grey tea. Hot, not lukewarm. Then that's what she gets, Colt said. Put it on my tab. You don't have a tab. I do now. A crack of laughter broke through Willa's tears. Small and broken and completely real. Bet turned toward the kitchen. She did not go straight there. She detoured past the corner booth, leaned down close to Colt's ear, and she told him. All of it. The nephew, the wife, the papers, the power of attorney, the doctor's report, the house worth $1.4 million. The court date on Monday. Every word she had overheard, every detail she had been carrying for 6 days like a stone in the center of her chest. Colt did not move while she spoke, did not blink. His face could have been carved out of the same granite as the mountains outside. When she finished, she straightened up and walked to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Colt's voice very quiet. We are not leaving this booth. Not until this is done. She heard Deacon take his reading glasses out of his chest pocket and put them away. She heard Brick's knuckles crack under the table. She heard Slade lean forward and say something she couldn't quite catch, and she heard Ridge, who almost never spoke, say 2 words in a voice like a door closing. He won't. Bet put the lemon cake on a blue plate. She put the kettle on. She went back to the counter, and she waited. At 11:51, Colt checked his watch and said something to his brothers that Bet couldn't hear. She saw Tex stop fidgeting. She saw Deacon fold his hands on the table. She saw Slade's eyes go to the door and stay there. At 11:53, Colt took both of Willa's hands in his. Her hands disappeared inside his small white birds, swallowed by leather and scar tissue. When he walks through that door, Colt said, You don't say a word. Not one word. You sit right here next to me and you let us handle it. Can you do that? Willa nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again. I'm scared, she admitted. Good, Colt said. That means you're paying attention. But Willa, look at me. She looked at him. You walked up to 6 Hell's Angels and asked us to be your family. Do you know how many people would have done that? She shook her head. None, he said. No one else in this room would have done what you just did. A woman who does that is not weak. A woman who does that is the bravest person I have met in 30 years on the road. Willa pressed her lips together hard. Now eat your lemon cake, Colt said. Your son is telling you to eat. She laughed. She picked up her fork. And then, because life is rarely interested in giving you a moment to collect yourself before the next thing begins, the bell above the door jingled. Preston Garvey walked in, brown leather folder under one arm, Leanne behind him, phone in hand, sunglasses pushed up on her head. They were smiling. They were confident. They had come to collect a signature from a frightened old woman sitting alone at a window booth, and they had absolutely no doubt in the world that that was what they were about to do. They found her in the corner booth, surrounded by 6 Hell's Angels, eating lemon cake. Preston's smile did not disappear immediately. It went through stages. It froze. It cracked. It slid off his face like something that had never really been attached. Leanne walked into his back. Preston's eyes moved across the booth. Leather, patches, tattoos. 6 men who looked like they had been cut from the same hard material as the mountains outside. And in the middle of them, like something precious held inside a fist of iron, Willa Greer. Sitting upright, cake on her fork, eyes clear, she was smiling. Colt did not stand. He did not need to. He looked at Preston Garvey the way a man looks at something small. Crossing a field he has been watching for a long time. Patient, certain, waiting. Preston found his voice. Aunt Willa, tight, controlled. I see you have some company. Willa opened her mouth and then caught Colt's eye and closed it. Colt spoke instead. She does. 2 words, flat, final, a small, careful silence. And you are, Preston asked. Colt smiled. The kind of smile that has nothing in it that resembles friendliness. I'm her son. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Leanne's phone hand dropped to her side. That's not possible, she said. She doesn't have children. Brick looked over from across the table. His voice was a low, unhurried rumble. She's got 6. Preston's grip tightened on the leather folder. Betty could see his knuckles going white along the edges. He was recalibrating. She could see it happening behind his eyes, the rapid, cold arithmetic of a man who has invested months in a plan and is deciding whether to adapt it or abandon it. He chose to adapt. Aunt Willa, he said softer now, reaching for the gentleness that had always been his most effective weapon. I think there may be some misunderstanding here. These men don't know your situation. They don't know what you're facing. I'm your family. I'm the one who has been visiting you, looking out for you, making sure you're taken care of. He paused, let his eyes move deliberately across the booth. Is this really who you want making decisions about your future? It was a good move. Betty had to give him that. Calculated, clean, designed to remind Willa that these men were strangers and he was known. That familiarity was safety, and the unfamiliar was risk. She watched Colt's hand close over Willa's on the table. One firm, quiet press. Steady. Willa lifted her chin. Preston, she said. Her voice was shaking, but it was getting stronger with each word, like a fire that has found its air. You gave me a phone that only calls you. You brought a doctor to my house who stood in my living room for 12 minutes and never once sat down and then wrote a report saying, I cannot think straight. You want me to sign away my home, the home your Uncle Earl built with his own hands, so you can sell it. She looked at Preston directly, through him. These men have known me for 45 minutes, she said, and in those 45 minutes they have shown me more kindness than you have shown me in 2 years. The diner was so quiet that Beatty could hear the ice settling in someone's water glass at the far end of the counter. I am not signing anything, Willa said. Not today, not Monday, not ever, not. Something moved through Preston's face. Just for a second. Just long enough. Bet saw it, and she knew that Willa had been seeing it for months under all the pressed khakis and the practiced smiles. The cold, stripped-down fury of a man who has been denied something he had already decided belonged to him. You're making a mistake, he said, low, almost a whisper. Colt stood up. He didn't rush. He didn't lunge or raise his voice or make a single movement that was not completely, deliberately controlled. He simply rose the way a mountain decides to be taller, and he extended one hand toward Preston, palm open. The folder, he said. Every sound in the diner stopped. Even the ceiling fan seemed to pause. "These are legal documents," Preston said. "You cannot—" "I didn't ask what they are," Colt said. His hand did not move. His eyes did not move. "I said give them to me." 10 seconds passed. Preston Garvey looked around the diner. He looked at Dale and Hank at the counter. He looked at the young couple in the far booth. He looked at Leonard standing in the kitchen window. He looked at Bet standing behind the counter with a coffee pot she had forgotten again. He looked at 6 bikers and at Willa, who was not trembling anymore. He handed over the folder. Colt took it. He did not open it. He did not read it. He took it in both hands and he tore it in half. The sound was sharp and clean and very final, like something being decided. Then he tore it again and again. Paper fell across the table in pieces. Colt brushed his hands clean and sat back down. There, he said, simpler. Willa covered her mouth with both hands. Her eyes were streaming, but she was not crying from fear. Those were notarized documents. Preston's voice had gone thin, all the polish worn off it. "I will call the police. I will have all of you." For what? Slade leaned back in the booth with his arms crossed, easy and unhurried. Destroying papers, an elderly woman never agreed to sign go ahead. "Call them. We'll wait." He gestured at the table. "We've got coffee." Preston opened his mouth, closed it. Something had left him. Betty could see the exact moment it went. Colt leaned forward. "Not far, just enough. Here is what is going to happen," he said. His voice was quiet. The quiet of a man who has no need to prove what he holds. "You are going to cancel your Monday appointment. Willa is going to see an independent doctor. One she chooses. Not you, not anyone you arrange." He paused. "And if we hear that you have contacted her, visited her, or sent anyone to her home without her permission, you will see us again. And next time we will not be sitting in a diner eating lemon cake." Leanne grabbed Preston's arm. Hard. "We're leaving," she said. Preston stumbled back a step. He looked at Willa one more time, and what Bet saw in his eyes then was not anger. It was not even calculation. It was fear. The fear of a man who had built a very careful plan and is watching the walls of it close in from all directions at once. The bell above the door jingled as they pushed through it. Silence held the room for 3 full seconds. Then Willa turned into Colt's side and wept. Deep, full years of loneliness weeping that shook her entire small body. Colt wrapped both arms around her and held her. Brick put his hand on her back. Deacon took off his reading glasses and cleaned them very carefully and did not put them back on. Tex stared at the table with his jaw locked and his eyes too bright. Slade looked out the window. Ridge bowed his head. From somewhere near the counter, someone began to clap. It was Dale. Then Hank. Then the young couple in the far booth. Then Leonard in the kitchen window, flour on his hands, clapping steadily. Then Bet, who had tears running down her face and had stopped caring who noticed. It was not a loud sound. It was not a triumphant one. It was something quieter than triumph. The sound of a room full of strangers who had just witnessed something they would not forget, something real and messy and imperfect and entirely, absolutely human. Willa lifted her head from Colt's chest. Her silver hair had come loose. Her eyes were red. Her face was wet. She looked around at these men, these 6 strangers who had said yes to a question nobody else would have heard. "I asked for 1 son," she said. Colt looked at her. "You got 6, he said, "and we don't do refunds." Willa laughed through her tears, and Bet, standing behind the counter in Milford's Diner on Route 9 in Billings, Montana, set down her coffee pot and thought with absolute certainty that this was not over. Preston Garvey was not a man who walked away. He was a man who regrouped, and whatever was coming next would be worse than what had just happened. She was sure of it. Standing there in the wreckage of what had just been something beautiful and frightened and brave, she was already thinking ahead, already thinking about what she knew and what she had heard and what she needed to do with it. Because Willa Greer had walked toward the most dangerous table in the room and asked 6 strangers to love her. And they had said yes. But saying yes was only the beginning. It took Preston Garvey exactly 41 hours to regroup. The first sign came on Saturday morning, 2 days after the diner. Willa's landline rang at 8:30. Not the cell phone Preston had given her, the old landline, the number she had kept since 1978, the one Preston had apparently not thought to account for because he had been so focused on controlling the phone he had provided that he had not considered the one that had simply always been there. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Breathing, Then a click, then silence. The second call came 90 minutes later. This time it was Leanne. The voice was warm in the way that certain things are warm on the surface and cold an inch below. Honey over something hard. Willa, sweetheart, I just want you to know that we are not angry. We understand that you were confused. We understand that those men took advantage of your trust, and we forgive you completely. But we do need to talk. Just family. No strangers involved. Could we come by this afternoon just to sit down together? Willa gripped the receiver. Her knuckles ached with it. No, she said. Willa, we just want to. I said no, Leanne. She hung up. She set the receiver down carefully, as though being careful about it mattered, as though the precision of the gesture could contain the trembling in her hands. She stood at the kitchen counter for a moment. Then she noticed something. Her spine felt different. It had felt different since Thursday, like something had been installed in it overnight while she was sleeping. Something straighter, something harder, like a rod of something that did not bend. She picked up the prepaid phone Colt had given her before they left the diner Thursday night and pressed the button. He answered on the second ring. Ma. One syllable. She had heard him say it 6 times now, and each time it opened something in her chest that she had believed was sealed. They called, she said. Leanne, she wants to come by today. A brief pause. Did you say yes? I said no. Good. Don't answer the landline again. She heard something shift in his voice, a decision being made. I'm sending Slade. You don't have to talk to him if you don't want to, but he'll be there. You don't have to do that, Colt. His voice dropped slightly, the way it did when he meant something completely and did not want any room for it to be misunderstood. Willa, a man who calls and breathes and hangs up is a man running a test. He's checking whether you're alone. Slade will be there in 20 minutes. She closed her eyes. Okay. Slade arrived in 18 minutes. He parked his Harley in the driveway, walked up to the porch, and sat down in Earl's old rocking chair, as though he had been sitting in it his whole life. He had a paperback novel and a thermos of coffee, and he settled into the chair the way a man settles into something he intends to occupy for as long as necessary. He nodded at Willa through the screen door. Morning, Ma. She pushed the door open. Have you eaten already? Ate, but I won't turn down toast. She made toast. 2 slices butter and the strawberry jam she had put up herself last August from the berries along the south fence. She brought it out on one of the blue flower plates, the ones she had started using again after too many years of saving them for occasions that never quite arrived. Slade took the plate the way you take something that has been offered with care. He ate. They sat together on the porch in the particular silence that exists between people who do not need to fill every moment with sound. Then a silver sedan appeared at the far end of the road. Slade set his coffee down. His posture did not change. Nothing about him changed visibly, but Willa felt the shift the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. The sedan slowed as it came close. Preston was driving. Leanne in the passenger seat. They pulled up alongside the mailbox and stopped. They sat there in the idling car, and they looked at the porch, and they saw Slade in Earl's rocking chair, and they saw the Harley in the driveway. Slade did not wave. He did not stand. He did nothing at all except look at them with the patient, steady attention of something that has decided it is not going anywhere. 30 seconds passed. The sedan pulled away. Willa let out a breath she had been holding since the car appeared at the end of the road. Thank you, she said. Slade picked up his toast. Nothing to thank. This is good jam. You make it yourself every August since 1974. He looked at the jar she had brought out with the plate. Well, he said, that's reason enough to be here. Willa smiled, and it reached her eyes. It had been reaching her eyes more often in the last 2 days than it had in the last 3 months. The following Monday arrived the way difficult days always arrive. Ordinary on the outside, the same light through the kitchen window, the same coffee, the same pine trees standing where Earl had put them. Slade drove her to Milford's for breakfast because she had asked him to and because he understood without being told that she needed to be somewhere that felt like herself that morning. They sat in the window booth. Bet brought the tea without being asked. The 3 of them existed together in the comfortable quiet of people who have been through something and come out the other side of it changed. Then Bet looked up at the sound of boots on the diner steps. She had been half expecting it. She had been half expecting some next move since Thursday, since the moment she had stood behind the counter and watched Preston Garvey's car pull out of the parking lot, and known with the certainty of someone who listens carefully to the world that he was not finished. Preston came in alone. No folder, no Leanne, no practiced smile. Just a man in a collared shirt sitting down at the counter as though he were a regular, as though he had a right to the space, as though Thursday had been a minor inconvenience that had since been processed and filed away. He ordered coffee, black. He stirred it for 20 minutes without drinking a single sip. Willa and Slade were visible from the counter. Preston did not look at them. He kept his eyes on his coffee cup and the surface of the counter and bet in the steady peripheral way of a man who was not watching but was watching everything. Bet kept moving, refilled cups at the far end, wiped down the pastry case, came back to where he was sitting. "You told them." She stopped. "Don't play stupid, Bet." His voice was calm, controlled. The kind of calm that is not the absence of anger, but the management of it, the deliberate, tight lid on something that would be genuinely dangerous if it got out. "It doesn't suit you. Those men didn't just happen to adopt an elderly woman. Someone with access told them what was happening, someone close enough to have heard things that were said in this diner." He turned on the stool. He looked at her directly. "That was you." Bet met his eyes. She felt the cold move through her stomach, and she let it pass through, and she answered him steadily. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't." His jaw flexed. "Let me tell you something. You work in a diner. You make, what, $30,000 a year with tips if you're lucky. You have no savings of any significance, no assets, no family in this state. I know this because I checked." Bet's stomach dropped an inch. "You checked. I'm thorough. It's what I do. So let me be completely clear with you. If you have been making slanderous statements about me to those bikers or to anyone else in this town, I will file a defamation suit that will cost you more than you will earn in the next 10 years. I will make your life so expensive and so complicated that you will have no choice but to leave this job, this town, and whatever small life you have managed to build here." He took a sip of his coffee. Finally, like punctuation. "That is not a threat. That is a preview." He set a $5 bill on the counter. He stood up. He smoothed the front of his shirt. He walked out. Bet stood behind the counter for 60 seconds. The coffee pot in her hand had gone cold. Her pulse was loud in her ears. She was aware of Willa and Slade in the window booth, aware of the other customers at their tables, aware of Leonard in the kitchen window. She set the coffee pot down. She went to the back. She picked up her phone and she called Colt. Colt arrived at the diner in 12 minutes. He came alone, which surprised her. He sat in the corner booth, and she sat across from him, and she told him everything. Word for word, the way Preston had stirred his coffee without drinking it. The way he had said, "I'm thorough," like it was something he was proud of. The way he had put dollar amounts on her life with the precision of a man who had already calculated exactly how much it would take to make her stop. Colt listened without moving. When she finished, he asked one question. "Are you scared?" She thought about lying. She didn't. "Yes," he nodded. "Good," he said. "You should be, but here is what you need to understand. Men like Preston Garvey do not go after people who can fight back. They go after people who are isolated, people who are alone. Willow was alone. That was why he chose her. Now he thinks you're alone too." He leaned forward slightly. "You're not." Betty felt something give way in her chest, not collapse, release. The specific relief of being seen clearly by someone who understands exactly what kind of danger looks like when it comes wearing a collared shirt. "What do I do?" she asked. "Nothing different. You come to work. You do your job. If he comes in, you serve him his coffee and you walk away. You do not engage. You do not argue. You let him talk to a wall. And if he actually files a lawsuit," Colt's jaw tightened briefly. "He won't." "How do you know?" "Because a lawsuit means discovery. It means his financial records get opened. It means his communications are subpoenaed. It means the arrangement he made with Stanton gets examined in a room with a judge present. Preston Garvey is not going to invite a court to look at what is under his hood. He is a bully with a briefcase and bullies fold when they find out the other person isn't going to flinch." Bet looked at him across the table. "You sound like you've dealt with this before." Something crossed Colt's face. Fast and real and painful in the particular way of old wounds that have healed imperfectly. I had a mother, he said. I didn't protect her. I was 19 and already on the road, and I told myself she was fine, that she didn't need me, that I'd check in properly next month. And by the time I finally understood what was happening to her, she had already signed everything over to a man who had spent 8 months telling her he loved her and couldn't live without her. He stopped. Bet waited. She died in a state facility 6 months later, in a room with a number on the door instead of her name. She held my hand the last time I saw her, and she said, "It's okay, Jack. I know you were busy." She forgave me. He cleared his throat. I have never forgiven myself. He looked at Bet. So when a frightened old woman walks up to my table and asks me to be her son, that is not a coincidence. That is, whatever you want to call it, giving me a second chance. And I am not going to waste it. Betty could not speak. She looked at the table, then at him. Now Colt said, his voice shifting back to the practical, because he was a man who felt things deeply and did not allow himself to drown in them. There is something I need you to do. Anything. File an anonymous report with Adult Protective Services. Tonight. Everything you heard, every date, every detail, the doctor, the phone, the isolation, the value of the property, the pressure campaign. All of it. Can you do that? Yes. Don't wait. Do it tonight. He stood. He put a 20 on the table for the coffee he hadn't ordered and walked to the door. At the threshold, he stopped and turned back. Bet. She looked up. Thank you for hearing her. Most people walk through a room and hear nothing. You heard her. He left. Betty sat in the booth for a long time in the quiet of the late afternoon diner. Then she pulled out her phone, found the number for the Montana Adult Protective Services hotline, and made the call that would, in ways she could not yet see, begin to pull apart everything Preston Garvey had built. Wednesday came. Deacon picked Willa up at 8 in the morning in his truck, a Ford F-150 that he had cleaned inside for the first time in what Colt had privately estimated to be several years. The floor mats were damp from washing. There was a pine air freshener on the rearview mirror that smelled aggressively of forests. Willa climbed in with her good cardigan buttoned to the throat and her purse on her lap and said without looking at him that she appreciated the effort with the truck. Deacon said he didn't know what she meant. She looked at him, he looked at the road. They drove in silence to Helena, which Willa appreciated. She was not a woman who needed to fill a car ride with talk. She looked out at the Montana morning, at the land opening up flat and then beginning to rise at the sky, which was the particular pale blue of early fall, and she thought about Earl, who had driven this road with her more times than she could count, who had always held her hand on long drives even after 40 years of marriage, who had made her feel for the 42 years they had together that she was the most important thing in whatever room they occupied. She thought about what she was going to say to the doctor. She thought about what it meant that she had to say anything at all, that she had to sit in a room and prove with tests and questions and the performance of her own competence that she was who she had always been, that she had to demonstrate to a stranger what anyone who had known her for 5 minutes could have told them for free. She thought about the 7 words she had said in the diner, and she thought about what it had taken to say them, and she thought that if she could do that, she could do this. Dr. Carolyn Voss was based out of a neurology practice in a low brick building on the east side of Helena, and she was nothing like Dr. Stanton. She was a woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses on a chain and an unhurried manner that communicated immediately and completely that she was not going anywhere until she understood exactly who she was dealing with. She shook Willa's hand. She offered her water or tea. She sat down, not at a desk across it from Willa, at a distance, in a chair angled toward Willa's at conversational range. She sat down and she looked at Willa and she said, "Tell me about yourself," and she meant it. The evaluation took 2 hours and 11 minutes. Dr. Voss asked about Willa's medical history, her medications, her sleep, her appetite, her daily routine. She asked about Earl. She asked about the garden. She asked about Ruth, Willa's sister. She administered cognitive assessments, the memory tests, and the clock drawings, and the pattern recognition, but she did them as part of a conversation rather than as a transaction, and she explained each one before she administered it, and she thanked Willa after each one, and she wrote things down with the attention of someone for whom the writing actually mattered. In 20 years of practice, Dr. Voss had conducted hundreds of these evaluations. She had learned to recognize, within the first 20 minutes, the difference between a patient who was genuinely struggling and a patient who was simply frightened. Willa Greer was not struggling. She was furious in a quiet, controlled way that Dr. Voss found both admirable and entirely consistent with full cognitive capacity. At the end of 2 hours and 11 minutes, Dr. Voss removed her reading glasses and let them rest on the chain. Mrs. Greer, she said, you are not cognitively impaired. Your memory is within the expected range for a healthy 86-year-old. Your reasoning is intact. Your judgment is sound. There is nothing in this evaluation that would support a finding of incompetency. Willa looked at her. She had known this. She had known it the way you know things about yourself that are simply true, that require no external confirmation. But there is a difference between knowing something and being told it by someone with the authority and the thoroughness to mean it. I'm not losing my mind, Willa said. No, ma'am, you are not. Willa pressed her hand flat against her sternum. She closed her eyes. She held her breath for 3 seconds and then released it slowly. And in the release was 17 weeks of fear, 17 weeks of sitting in a diner watching a door, 17 weeks of holding her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking where anyone could see. She whispered something that Deacon, standing in the hallway outside, heard through the half-open door. Thank you, Earl. Dr. Voss had one more thing to say. She said it carefully with the precision of someone who understood the weight of what they were about to put into the room. Mrs. Greer, I have reviewed the evaluation filed on your behalf by a Dr. Rudy Stanton. I have serious concerns about his findings and his methodology. She paused. A 12-minute assessment conducted by a physician who did not sit down, did not review medical history, did not obtain collateral information, and did not perform a comprehensive cognitive battery does not meet any recognized standard of care for this type of evaluation. A legitimate cognitive assessment requires time, context, and the fundamental courtesy of treating the patient as a person rather than a formality. What Dr. Stanton filed does not reflect what I see in front of me today. Willa looked at her for a long moment. I think Willa said measured and careful that I may already have some help in that direction. Dr. Voss nodded. Good, she said. Keep it close. Deacon drove her home. Willa held the evaluation report on her lap the way she sometimes held Earl's letters, the ones from the early years before they were married, which she kept in the drawer of the nightstand on her side of the bed that was still her side even now. She held it like it was evidence of something, which it was. Evidence that she existed, that she was real and present and worth seeing, that someone had looked at her and seen a person instead of a transaction. Colt was waiting on the porch when they pulled in. He came down the steps as Deacon parked. He opened Willa's door and offered his hand, and she took it, not because she needed it, but because it was offered, and there is a difference. Deacon handed him the report. Colt read it standing on the porch steps, every word slowly with the report held in both hands. When he finished, he folded it with care and handed it back to Willa. Put it somewhere safe, he said. Somewhere Preston can't find it. Earl's gun's safe. In the basement. Colt looked at her. You remember the combination she gave him, the look of a woman who had heard a great many foolish questions in 86 years and had developed a face for them. June 14th, 1963. I think I can manage. He almost smiled. Almost. Go put it away, Ma. She went inside. And while she was downstairs, Colt stood on the porch and Deacon stood beside him and looked at the house in the late afternoon light, and Deacon said what he had been seeing since the first Saturday he had walked around the property. The east gutter is pulling away from the fascia. 2 sections. The porch rail on the north side needs the posts re-anchored. They've been heaving with the frost. There's something going on with the foundation vent on the southeast corner that I want to get under and look at. And Colt, the kitchen faucet has been dripping for what looks like years. There's water damage under the sink cabinet that's been sitting long enough to go soft. Colt looked at the house. The white paint going thin in places. The garden beds that had been empty and overgrown when they arrived and were now turned and waiting, the tomato plants they had put in along the south fence beginning to take hold. Saturday, Colt said. All of us. Full day. Deacon nodded. Then he said something he had been holding back since the drive back from Helena. Colt, that report Stanton filed, Voss said it was inadequate and she was being professional about it. If he fabricated a medical evaluation for Preston, that is not just malpractice. That is a crime, I know. So what do? We let Betts' report do the work it was designed to do. APS investigates. They pull Stanton's records. They find the connection to Preston, and when they do, it unravels on its own. He looked at Deacon. And if it doesn't unravel fast enough, then we pull the thread ourselves. That night, Slade's phone buzzed in the kitchen while Willa was washing the supper dishes. Slade read the message. He read it again. He set the phone face down on the counter and looked at it for a moment, the way a man looks at something he needs to think about before he speaks. He went to find Colt, who was on the porch. He told him quietly away from the kitchen window. Preston had filed a new competency petition that morning. Not with the county court, with the district court in Billings, a new judge. Someone who had never heard Willa's name, never seen what had happened in the diner, knew nothing about any of it. And Stanton had filed an amended report, an extended evaluation he was calling it, claiming he had conducted a follow-up assessment the previous week. Willa had not seen Stanton since the first visit. Colt stood on the porch for a long moment. The mountains were black against the sky going dark, and the pine trees were moving in the evening wind. And inside the kitchen, Willa was still washing dishes, still humming something low and old that he couldn't quite make out. The hearing was set for 7 days out. Does she know? Colt asked. Not yet. Don't tell her tonight. He looked through the kitchen window at Willa. She got her evaluation today. She got good news today. Let her have this evening. Then what? We need a lawyer. The name had been sitting in the back of his mind since the day after the diner. Slade had mentioned Miriam Dunbar 3 days ago, an elder law attorney out of Missoula. Someone Slade knew through a connection that had its own complicated history, but the history was the history's problem. Right now, the only thing that mattered was that Miriam Dunbar was exactly the kind of attorney that cases like this one required. Call her, Colt said. Right now, tonight. Tell her everything. Slade pulled out his phone and walked to the far end of the porch. Colt stood alone. He looked at his mother's photograph on his own phone for a moment, that old photograph of her standing in front of a house that hadn't been hers anymore by the time it was taken, smiling because she was the kind of woman who smiled for photographs, regardless of what was true behind the smile. He put the phone away. Inside, Willa finished the dishes. She dried her hands on the towel with the embroidered border that had been a gift from her sister Ruth 20 Christmases ago. She folded it over the oven handle. She walked to the front door and looked through the screen at Colt on the porch. Jack. He turned. Come inside, it's getting cold. I'm fine. She gave him the look. I didn't ask if you were fine. I said come inside. He came inside. She handed him a slice of lemon cake on one of the blue flower plates and pointed at the kitchen chair. And he sat down. She sat across from him. And neither of them said anything about Preston or Stanton or the 7 days ahead, because some silences are strategy and some silences are just two people sitting in a kitchen they both know is worth fighting for. Slade came back inside 8 minutes later. His face said everything before he spoke. Miriam's in, he said. She said if a doctor is fabricating competency evaluations, she will take this case for free and she will enjoy every second of it. For the first time since Slade's phone had buzzed, Colt's shoulders dropped half an inch. When can she meet Willa Monday? She'll drive up from Missoula. Good, Colt looked at Willa, and we don't tell her about the new petition until Miriam is here. She needs to hear the bad news and the good news at the same time. Willa looked at him, then at Slade. She was not a woman who missed much. There is more bad news, she said. It was not a question. Colt looked at her steadily. There is, and it will keep until Monday. Tonight, you're going to finish your lemon cake and get some sleep. Willa held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her fork. You're very bossy for someone who isn't actually my son, she said. He almost smiled again. He was getting better at almost smiling. I'm learning from the best, he said. Saturday came in cold and clear. By 7 in the morning, 6 Harleys and Deacon's battered truck were parked in Willa's driveway. Colt had brought a full set of tools in a canvas bag. Brick had driven to the lumberyard at 6 and loaded the truck bed with new porch boards, deck screws, and 2 sections of gutter with the brackets to hang them. Tex had brought a push mower he had borrowed from his neighbor. Slade had paint white to match the original and a half-dozen brushes. Ridge had said nothing about what he was bringing and arrived with a complete set of electrical tools and a voltage tester that told its own story about where he expected the morning to go. Deacon went straight to the kitchen. Willa was already up dressed, standing at the counter with her coffee, and when she saw them all filing in from the driveway, she pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment, and then straightened up and said in a voice that was completely steady, "Oh, I'd better start making sandwiches." They worked through the morning in the easy coordination of men who had been doing difficult things together for a long time. Brick went under the porch on his back in the cold mud and spent 2 hours pulling out rotted boards and replacing them from below, handing the old wood out through the gap and installing new planks with the focused patience of a man who understood that some things had to be done from underneath. The sound of his work came up through the new boards like a heartbeat, steady and unhurried. Deacon reattached the gutter section by section, up and down the ladder, with the measured economy of a man who did not waste a movement refastening the brackets to solid wood and checking the pitch with a level he kept in his shirt pocket. Text mode. The lawn had been unmowed for longer than it should have been, the grass gone thick and matted, and the push mower fought him on the corners. He fought back. By 10 o'clock, the lawn was cut, and Tex was sweating and had grass stains from his knees to his boots and looked approximately satisfied. Ridge went directly to the electrical panel with his voltage tester. He found 3 outlets with grounding issues and a junction box in the basement that had been improperly connected for what looked like years. He fixed each one without comment, leaving only the faint smell of electrical contact cleaner as evidence of where he had been. Slade sanded the porch rails from one end to the other, working with fine sandpaper and a sanding block getting into the corners where the old paint had built up over decades of Montana winters. When the rail was bare and smooth, he primed it and stood back and looked at it with the critical attention of someone who would not apply paint to something that was not ready to receive it. Colt went to the kitchen. He lay on his back under the sink for 40 minutes. The drip had been going long enough that the cabinet floor had softened and would need to be replaced, but the source was a corroded fitting on the supply line that was simple enough to fix if you had the right parts, which Colt had because he had looked under the sink on Wednesday and driven to the hardware store in Billings on Thursday. He replaced the fitting, replaced the supply line, tightened the drain connections, and when he turned the water on, the faucet ran clean and silent for the first time in longer than anyone could remember. He pushed himself out from under the cabinet and sat up and looked at the kitchen. The old pine cabinets Earl had built, the cast iron skillet on its hook, the crack in the linoleum near the back door, the shelf above the refrigerator where Earl's photograph stood. Then he stood up and went out to the garden. The beds along the south fence had been cleared when they planted the tomatoes 3 weeks ago, the old dead stalks pulled and the soil turned. The plants had taken hold. They were small, still just a few inches of green above the dark soil, but they were there. They had rooted. They were going to grow. Willa came out through the back door. She stood beside Colt at the edge of the garden. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The mountains were clear in the morning light, the sky enormous and pale and clean, the way Montana sky gets in fall when the air has a bite in it. You didn't have to do the garden, Willa said. Earl grew tomatoes every year. I know he did. Colt looked at the plants. Every year the first one of the season was for you. He always brought it to me like it was something rare, Willa said. Like he had found it rather than grown it. She was quiet for a moment. After 60 years, I still used to look forward to it. Colt looked at her. Then the first one of the season is for you, he said. Same as always. Willa reached out and put her hand on his arm. Just briefly. Just enough. Jack, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. Why are you doing all of this? Not just today, all of it, from the beginning. Colt looked at the garden. He looked at the mountains beyond the tree line. He looked at his hands scarred and calloused and stained with road grease, and now with primer from the porch rails and grease from under the kitchen sink. Because someone should have done it a long time ago, he said, and because I wasn't there for someone else when it mattered. He did not explain further. He did not need to. Willa squeezed his arm once and let go. By noon, the porch boards were solid, the gutters reattached and properly pitched. The kitchen faucets silent, the lawn cut, the rails sanded and primed. The electrical issues Ridge had found were corrected, and the house was in ways that went beyond the physical repairs, safer than it had been in years. Willa brought the sandwiches out to the porch. Turkey mustard, the good bread from the bakery in town. Lemon cake that Bet had dropped off that morning with a note that said, "Give them hell, Willa," in handwriting that leaned forward like something in a hurry. They ate on the new porch boards in the fall sunlight. For 20 minutes, nobody talked about Preston or Stanton or court dates. Tex made a joke that nobody laughed at. Deacon told a story about a road trip to Sturgis in 1997 that involved a misidentified campsite and a state trooper who had in Deacon's account a surprisingly good sense of humor about the whole thing. Willa laughed so hard she spilled her lemonade on Brick's boot, and Brick said it was the most distinguished thing that had happened to that boot in years. Ridge ate his sandwich and said nothing and looked entirely content. Willa sat on the new porch boards of the house Earl had built and looked out at the garden where the tomato plants were rooting in the turned soil and listened to these men, her impossible and improbable and entirely unlooked-for family, and she thought that this was the best afternoon she had had since Earl died. Then Slade's phone buzzed. He glanced at it. His face changed. He stood up and walked to the far end of the porch and read the message again. Then he walked back to Colt and leaned down. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Colt read Slade's face the way he read a highway fast and accurately and without room for second guessing. He looked at Willa. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder. "We'll be right back, Ma." They went inside the kitchen. Slade told him. The new petition, the district court in Billings, the fabricated second evaluation, the hearing in 7 days. Colt's jaw tightened so slowly and so completely that Slade could hear his back teeth grind. "Does she know?" "Not yet. Keep it that way today." He looked toward the porch, toward the window where Willa was visible, eating the last of her lemon cake, talking to Brick about something that was making both of them laugh. "She had this afternoon. She earned it." He looked at Slade. "But tonight we call Miriam Dunbar." They went back to the porch. Willa looked up when Colt sat down beside her. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Working on it," he said. He picked up his coffee. "You want more lemonade?" She studied him for a moment with those sharp, clear eyes. "No," she said, "but I want you to tell me what Slade just told you, and I want you to tell me before the day is out." Colt looked at her. He nodded once. "Tonight," he said. "We'll talk tonight." She held his gaze. Then she accepted it and turned back to the view, to the mountains, and the garden, and the pine trees Earl had planted 59 years ago, because she was cold, and she let the afternoon be what it was. Whole and good and enough. The following Monday arrived the way difficult days always arrive. Ordinary on the outside, the same light through the kitchen window, the same coffee, the same pine trees standing where Earl had put them. Colt had told Willa everything Saturday night as promised. He had sat across from her at the kitchen table and told her about the new petition, the fabricated second report, the Billings District Court, the 7-day timeline. He had told her about Miriam Dunbar and that she was driving up from Missoula on Monday. He had watched Willa's face go white and then resolve the way it always resolved into something harder and quieter than the fear that had preceded it. She had asked one question. "Is there anything he can do that we can't answer?" Colt had thought about it honestly. "Not anymore," he said. Willa had nodded and gotten up and made them both tea, and they had sat together in the kitchen until late, not talking about Preston, talking about Earl, and about Colt's early years on the road, and about the summer of 1987, when Willa had grown so many tomatoes, she had given them away to half the county and still had more than she could use. Ordinary things. The kind of things that remind you who you are when someone has been working very hard to make you forget. Miriam Dunbar arrived at 10:30 in a silver Subaru that had seen the kind of mileage that accumulates when you spend 20 years driving to courthouses across the state of Montana. She parked behind the Slade's Harley, sat in the car for 30 seconds, and got out. Colt was on the porch. "You're Miriam Dunbar," he said. "I am," she said. "And before you ask, I am here for Willa. Not for Slade, not for whatever history any of us have, not for anything except what is happening to that woman inside this house. Are we clear?" Something shifted in Colt's expression. Not quite a smile. The acknowledgement of something that might become one. "We're clear," he said. "She's at the kitchen table." Willa was sitting where Miriam had expected to find her, at the center of her own world, in the kitchen Earl had built, with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea and Dr. Carolyn Voss's evaluation report laid out on the table in front of her like a map she had been studying for guidance. Miriam extended her hand. "Mrs. Greer, I'm Miriam Dunbar. I'm an elder law attorney and I would like to represent you. There would be no cost to you, none whatsoever." Willa took her hand, held it for a moment, studied her face with those sharp, clear eyes that had not softened 1 degree in the weeks since everything had begun. "Why would you do that?" Willa asked. Miriam sat down across from her. "Because I have spent 20 years fighting men like your nephew," she said. And because when a doctor fabricates a medical evaluation to strip an elderly woman of her home and her autonomy, that is not only your problem, Mrs. Greer, that is everyone's problem. If Rudy Stanton did this to you, he has done it to others. I want to stop him. She paused. I want to help you stop him. Willa looked at her for a long time. The measuring, unhurried look of a woman who had lived long enough to know the difference between people who meant what they said and people who had simply learned to say it convincingly. I like you, Willa said. Good, Miriam said, because I have something to tell you that you are not going to like. Willa's hand tightened around her teacup. Miriam told her everything. Preston's new petition filed with the district court in Billings. The new judge who had never heard Willa's name. Stanton's amended report, the fabricated second evaluation claiming a follow-up assessment that had never occurred. The hearing date now continued pending APS review, but still real, still on the books, still coming. Willa listened without interrupting. Her face went white, then something past white, something that was the particular color of a person absorbing the full weight of what has been done to them. He won't stop, she said when Miriam had finished. He will never stop. He will, Miriam said, because I am going to stop him, but I need your help, and I need you to trust me. What do you need? Miriam opened her briefcase. I need everything, every document, every letter, every phone record you have access to. The phone Preston gave you, any voicemails, any written communication. I need a detailed account of Dr. Stanton's visit. Everything you remember. What he asked, how long he stayed, what he did, and what he didn't do. Willa straightened in her chair. He was here for 12 minutes, she said. He stood in my living room. He asked me to count backwards from 100 and to draw a clock face on a piece of paper. He did not ask me about my medical history. He did not ask me about my medications. He did not review any of my prior records. He did not sit down. Miriam's pen stopped moving. He didn't sit down. He stood in the center of my living room the entire time. When he was finished, he walked out to the driveway and spoke with Preston for approximately 10 minutes. I watched from the window. They shook hands before Dr. Stanton drove away. Miriam set her pen down. She looked at Willa with something that was not quite controlled. In 20 years of practice, she said, I have never encountered a legitimate cognitive evaluation conducted by a physician who did not sit down. Not one. She paused. A 12-minute assessment with no medical history review, no collateral information, no review of prior records, and no physical examination does not meet any recognized standard of care. Combined with the fabricated second report, the controlled phone, and whatever Gerald Marsh is finding in Stanton's records right now, Preston Garvey's entire case collapses. Willa was quiet for a moment. 7 others, she said. At least 7. Gerald is still reviewing. Willa looked out the kitchen window at Earl's pine trees. They stood the way they always stood, patient and tall, and completely unmoved by everything that happened beneath them. Those people, Willa said. Those other 7 people. Do they still have their homes? Miriam was quiet for a moment. Not all of them, she said carefully. Willa closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had settled in her face. Something that was not resignation and not anger, but a combination of the two that was harder and quieter than either one separately. Then we do this right, Willa said. We do this so it cannot be undone. Miriam Dunbar looked at Willa Greer and thought, not for the first time since she had pulled into this driveway, that she was looking at someone who had been underestimated by everyone in her life for a very long time, and that this was Preston Garvey's most catastrophic miscalculation. Yes, ma'am, Miriam said. That is exactly what we do. They worked for 3 hours at that kitchen table. Miriam documented everything. She photographed the phone Preston had given Willa, confirmed that it contained a single contact. She took a full statement, date by date, detail by detail, from the first visit Preston had made after his 2 years of silence to the night he had parked in the driveway and left his headlights on like a warning. She reviewed Dr. Voss's evaluation line by line and made copies of every document, returning the originals to Earl's gun safe in the basement, the combination to which was June 14, 1963, and which Willa provided without hesitation or any patience for the suggestion that she might have forgotten it. When Miriam stood to leave, she shook Willa's hand again. Mrs. Greer, I want you to understand something. What Preston Garvey has done to you is not simply a civil matter. Elder financial abuse is a felony in Montana. If Gerald Marsh's investigation finds what I believe, it is going to find Preston will not only lose this case, he will face criminal charges. Willa nodded slowly. I don't want him in prison, she said. He is my sister's son. My sister loved him. I want him to stop. I want him to be stopped from doing this again, but I do not want him destroyed. Miriam's expression softened. That, she said, is your choice to make. But we cannot give him the option to continue, Mrs. Greer. What we can do is make certain that the door he has been trying to walk through is closed, permanently, for you and for anyone else he might consider. Willa walked her to the door. She stood on the new porch boards and watched Miriam's silver Subaru back down the driveway. Then she went back inside and stood in the kitchen and let herself be angry. Not the frightened, helpless anger of someone who cannot see a way through. The clear, focused anger of someone who finally can. She looked at Earl's photograph on the shelf. He tried to take this house, Earl, she said. Your house, the one you built, the one you planted those trees for. Her voice was steady. He is not going to get it. She picked up Colt's phone and pressed the button. He answered in 2 rings. Ma, we have a lawyer, Willa said, and she's angry. I think that's good. A pause, then Colt's voice warmed in the particular way it had become over the weeks. It's very good. I'm angry too, Willa said. I know, Colt said. Hold on to it, I intend to, she said. Now, are you hungry? Because I made soup and I am not letting it go to waste. The call came on a Wednesday morning and it came to the right person. Gerald Marsh had been with Adult Protective Services for 11 years. He had worked out of the Billings field office for 9 of those 11 years, and in that time, he had seen financial abuse dressed up in every costume it owned. He had seen it wearing the face of a loving spouse. He had seen it wearing the face of a trusted neighbor. He had seen it wearing the face of a son, a daughter, a niece, a nephew, a friend from church who had offered to help with the bills. He had learned over 11 years that financial abuse of the elderly was the quietest crime in the world. It left no bruises. It happened in living rooms and at kitchen tables and in the offices of notaries public in voices that were warm and reasonable and concerned. It was almost always invisible until it was complete, and by the time it was complete, there was almost never anything left to recover. He had read Bet Sailor's anonymous report 3 times before he picked up the phone. It was detailed, specific. It had dates and times and direct quotes. It named a doctor. It named a property value. It described isolation tactics with a clarity that told Gerald the person who filed it had done their homework, had sat up late reading about these things, had connected dots that most people never even saw as dots. Whoever had written this report was not a professional. They were something rarer and more valuable. They were paying attention. Gerald opened a case file. He typed the name at the top of the first page. Willa Greer, case number 2024-1187. Then he pulled up Dr. Rudy Stanton's license record in the Montana Medical Board database, and he started reading, and within 20 minutes he had stopped reading and was staring at the wall of his office with both hands flat on his desk. He picked up the phone and called Miriam Dunbar. She answered on the second ring. I've opened a formal investigation, Gerald said without preamble, because Miriam was not a woman who required preamble. The report I received on Willa Greer was detailed enough to trigger an immediate review. But Miriam, I pulled Stanton's records. A pause on her end. How bad? 7, Gerald said. The silence that followed was the kind that fills up with something other than quiet. 7 patients, he continued. 3 counties, 2 years, all evaluated by Stanton, all subsequently placed under conservatorship or had assets transferred to family members. All of those family members benefited financially, some of them substantially. He's running a mill, Miriam said. That is exactly what it looks like. The same family in all 7 cases. Number Stanton had multiple clients, multiple arrangements. Your Preston Garvey is one of several, but Gerald Garvey's case is the most deliberate of all of them, the most planned. The isolation tactics, the controlled phone, the 12-minute evaluation, the fabricated second report filed after the first confrontation. This wasn't opportunism. This was months of architecture. Miriam was quiet for a moment. Gerald could hear her thinking. I'm filing a motion to continue the hearing, she said. Today, with your investigation active, no judge in this state should allow a competency determination to proceed. I'll request that the court delay any ruling until APS completes its review. I'll have my formal recommendation to the court by end of day, Gerald said. And Stanton, I'm referring the matter to the Montana Board of Medical Examiners this afternoon. And to the county attorney's office. He paused. Miriam, if the board moves quickly on this, Stanton won't have a license to practice by the time this goes to trial. Another silence. This one different from the first. Lighter, you just saved her house, Miriam said. I haven't saved anything yet, Gerald said, but I intend to. He hung up. He sat at his desk for a moment. Then he opened the case file again and began to type. The hearing was set for a Tuesday. Willa woke before 5 that morning. She did not need an alarm. She had not needed one in decades. She lay in the dark for several minutes in the bed she had slept in for 61 years in the room at the top of the stairs that Earl had framed with his own hands, listening to the house breathe around her, the small familiar sounds of it, the tick of the baseboard. Heat, the distant sound of Slade moving around in the kitchen below. 2 months earlier, after she had fallen, reaching for a bowl on the top shelf, and had lain on the kitchen floor for 20 minutes before she could get to the phone, Colt had asked her a question. He had asked it carefully, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with her hands in his, looking at her the way he had looked at her since the beginning, directly without flinching, without the patronizing softness that people reserve for the very old, as though the very old had lost the capacity for direct address. He had asked her if she would consider letting Slade move into the spare bedroom. She had said she would think about it. She had thought about it for 2 days. She had talked to Slade, who had sat on the porch with her, and explained that he was a light sleeper and a decent cook and the only member of the chapter who cleaned up after himself, and who had listened without interrupting when she explained that she snored, and who had replied that he had shared a tent with Brick on 17 separate occasions, and she did not know what snoring was. He had moved in on a Thursday. He had put his boots by the back door and his jacket on the hook and his toothbrush in the bathroom cup beside hers. 2 toothbrushes. Such a small thing. The difference between alone and not measured in plastic and bristles. She got up. She put on her good cardigan, the dark blue one she saved for occasions. She went downstairs. Slade was already up. There was coffee made and toast on the counter, and he looked at her when she came in and said, "You look like someone who is about to win something." And she said, "I look like someone who is 86 years old and has had enough." And he said same thing and handed her the coffee. Colt arrived at 7. Brick and Deacon came together in Deacon's truck. Tex and Ridge came on their bikes. They filled the kitchen the way they always filled it, large and solid, and slightly too much for the space, and somehow exactly right for it anyway. They drove to the courthouse in Billings in 2 vehicles. Willa rode with Colt and Slade. She sat in the back seat with Earl's photograph in her lap because she had taken it down from the shelf that morning and put it in her bag, and she was not going to pretend she hadn't. The courthouse was a square brick building on a block that had not changed much since Willa was young. She had been inside it twice before. Once when Earl died and there were estate matters to settle. Once when Ruth, her sister, had needed a notary for something Willa could not now remember. Both times she had walked in as herself, a person was standing, a person with a name. She walked in that way again now. The courtroom was smaller than the ones on television. The ceiling was lower, the wood was darker, but it had the same quality that all courtrooms have: the weight of all the things that had been decided in it, the accumulated gravity of outcomes of lives redirected, of the irreversible made legal. Willa sat at the table beside Miriam. Colt sat directly behind her. She could feel him there without turning around. Deacon was beside Colt. The others were in the row behind. Preston and Leanne sat at the opposite table with a man in a gray suit who was Preston's attorney and who had until this morning believed he was going to win. The judge was a woman named Hargrove, 60 years old, with wire-rimmed glasses and the deliberate manner of someone who had heard every version of every story and was not interested in being manipulated by any of them. Miriam presented the case with the efficiency of someone who had been building it brick by brick 4 weeks and knew exactly where every piece fit. She presented Dr. Carolyn Voss's evaluation. 2 hours and 11 minutes. Comprehensive. Clean. She presented Dr. Stanton's evaluation. 12 minutes. No medical history, no collateral information, no sitting down. She presented the phone Preston had given Willa, programmed with a single contact. She presented the phone records showing the pattern of calls, all incoming from Preston, no outgoing possible to anyone else. She presented Gerald Marsh's preliminary findings. 7 other patients, 3 counties, 2 years. A pattern so consistent and so deliberate that it could not be attributed to anything except intention. Bette Saylor testified. She sat in the witness chair wearing the dress she kept for occasions that mattered, and she spoke carefully and precisely about what she had heard, what she had seen, what she had understood, and what she had done about it. Her voice did not shake. Not once. Then Miriam said the plaintiff would like to call Willa Greer. Willa stood. She walked to the witness stand. She sat down. She looked out at the courtroom, at the faces there, at Preston's face across the room, at Colt's face in the second row, steady and present as a fixed point. Judge Hargrove looked at her over the wire-rimmed glasses. Mrs. Greer, please tell the court, in your own words, about the home at the center of this proceeding. Willa folded her hands on the railing. My husband, Earl Greer, built that house in 1963, she said. He built it himself. He poured the foundation, and he framed the walls, and he finished the floors, and he built the kitchen cabinets out of pine that he milled himself from trees he had cleared from the eastern edge of the property. He planted a row of pines along the east fence that first winter we lived there, because I told him I was cold, and by the time he was finished planting them, his hands were bleeding through his gloves, and he came in and showed them to me like they were something he was proud of. She paused, not because she had lost her composure, because she wanted the room to sit with it for a moment. Earl died in 2005, she continued. He had a heart attack in the garden in July. He was holding the first tomato of the season when he went down. He grew a garden every year of our marriage. Every year he brought me the first tomato of the season like it was something precious. I found him that afternoon and he looked peaceful, and I have been grateful for that every day since. The courtroom was very quiet. I have lived in that house for 61 years, Willa said. I know every sound it makes and every season it wears. I know which floorboard creaks near the top of the stairs. I know how the kitchen fills with light on a clear December morning. I know where Earl's initials are scratched into the back of the pantry door when he was testing a chisel in 1971 and thought I wouldn't notice. She looked directly at Judge Hargrove. My nephew Preston has not visited me in any meaningful way for 2 years. He appeared at my door several months ago with a leather folder and a doctor I had never met. And in the weeks that followed, he arranged to have me evaluated by that doctor for 12 minutes, isolated from anyone who might have helped me by giving me a telephone that could only call him, and pressured repeatedly to sign documents that would have transferred control of my home and my finances to him before a court he had arranged could rule me incompetent. She did not look at Preston. I am not incompetent, she said. I am 86 years old. I am sometimes cold in the winter. I do not drive anymore. My hip makes climbing stairs slower than it used to be. But I know what year it is and who the president is and how much my house is worth and why my nephew wanted me to sign those papers. She paused. I know exactly what was happening to me. I knew it from the beginning. What I did not have was someone willing to stand beside me and say so. She looked at Colt. Just for a moment, I found that she said, in the most unlikely place I could have imagined. She turned back to Judge Hargrove. I would like to keep my home, she said simply, the home my husband built, the home I have lived in for 61 years. I am asking this court to let me do that. She folded her hands again and waited. It was at this moment that Preston's attorney received a notification on his phone. He read it once. He read it again. He set the phone face down on the table in front of him and looked at Preston, and whatever was on his face in that moment was not the expression of a man preparing to continue an argument. Miriam, who noticed everything, noticed this. She leaned toward Willa and said very quietly, something just happened on their side. What had happened was this. At 10:47 that morning, the Montana Board of Medical Examiners had issued an emergency suspension of Dr. Rudy Stanton's medical license pending a full investigation into 7 counts of fraudulent medical evaluation and 5 counts of elder financial abuse facilitation. Every evaluation Stanton had conducted in the previous 3 years was under review. Every document bearing his signature was as of that moment legally compromised pending the investigation's outcome. Preston Garvey's entire case rested on 2 documents. Both of them bore Stanton's signature. Both of them were, as of 10:47 that morning, worth exactly nothing. Preston's attorney leaned over and said something in a low voice. Preston went very still. The color left his face in a way that happened too quickly and too completely to be controlled. Leanne put her hand on his arm. He shook it off. Judge Hargrove looked over her glasses at the defense table. "Counselor," she said, "is there something you'd like to bring to the court's attention?" Preston's attorney stood. He was a competent man in difficult circumstances, and he did the only thing a competent man in those circumstances can do. He told the truth. "Your Honor, the court has just been informed that Dr. Rudy Stanton, whose evaluations constitute the evidentiary basis for this petition, has been suspended from medical practice by the Montana Board of Medical Examiners, pending investigation into multiple counts of professional misconduct. In light of this development, the defense would request a continuance to assess." "Denied," Judge Hargrove said. She looked at Preston Garvey for a long moment. The particular look of a person who has heard every story and has decided exactly which story this one is. "This petition is dismissed," she said, "with prejudice." She removed her glasses. She looked at Miriam and then at Willa. "Mrs. Greer," she said, "you are free to go home." The settlement happened 4 days later. Preston accepted every term Miriam put on the table. 2 years of supervised probation, full restitution of every legal fee Willa had incurred, a permanent restraining order, a lifetime prohibition on serving in any fiduciary or guardianship capacity over a vulnerable adult in the state of Montana. His attorney did not try to negotiate. There was nothing left to negotiate with. Rudy Stanton, 3 weeks after the hearing, entered a guilty plea on 3 counts of fraud and 2 counts of elder financial abuse. He was sentenced to 14 months in a minimum security facility. He would not practice medicine again. Preston and Leanne sold their house in Helena and moved to Arizona. 6 months later, a letter arrived at Willa's address. No return address, postmarked Scottsdale. A single sentence on a single sheet of paper. "I'm sorry." Willa read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with her coffee beside her and Earl's photograph on the shelf above the refrigerator. She sat with it for a long time. She looked at it the way she looked at everything that was difficult and true and beyond easy resolution. Then she folded it carefully in thirds and put it in the kitchen drawer between the spare batteries in the takeout menus she never used and the letter Earl had written her on their 40th anniversary that she had read so many times the creases had worn through. She never mentioned the letter again. Bet asked her once months later whether she had forgiven him. Willa considered the question for a long moment. "I don't hate him," she said. "He was my sister's child. I remember him as a boy. I remember what he was like before he became what he became, and I don't know when that happened or why, and I suppose I never will." She was quiet for a moment. "But forgiveness is a door, and I am not the one who closed it. He will have to find his own way to that." That was the last time either of them spoke his name. Winter came harder than usual that year. The first snow arrived before Thanksgiving, 6 inches overnight, and it stayed. The temperature dropped and kept dropping, and Willa's pipes came very close to freezing on a Tuesday in December before Slade caught it and got the heat tape on the vulnerable runs in the crawl space before anything burst. In January, Willa got sick. It started as a cold, the ordinary kind, a week of tea and rest, and Slade making soup in Earl's kitchen with a competence that Willa found both comforting and slightly surprising. But the cold moved into her chest and then deeper, and by the end of the second week, Dr. Voss had admitted her to St. Peter's Hospital in Helena with pneumonia. The hospital was the kind of place that exists outside of time. The halls were the same color at midnight as they were at noon. The machines beeped in rhythms that had nothing to do with the rhythms of ordinary life. The nights were very long. Colt took the first 2 nights. He sat in the chair beside Willa's bed with his jacket across his knees and his phone face down on the windowsill, and he was simply present, which was what was needed. When Willa woke in the small hours of the morning, disoriented and cold, in the particular way of hospital rooms, he was there. He got her water. He asked her what she needed. He stayed. Brick took the 3rd night. He was too large for the hospital chair, in a way that was almost comical. His knees angled out and his shoulders wider than the back of it, but he settled in with the same patient acceptance with which he approached everything that was not quite built to his scale. And when the night nurse came in at 2 in the morning and found him there, she did not ask questions. There was something in his presence that made questions feel unnecessary. Deacon came the 4th night and the 5th. He brought a book, the same one he had been reading at Milford's the week before, and he read quietly while Willa slept, and when she woke, he told her about the book in enough detail to distract her for the 20 minutes it took the night medications to do their work. Slade drove in from the house each morning to take the day shift sitting with Willa through the hours when the hospital was loudest and brightest and most disorienting, bringing her tea from the cafeteria that was not as good as her own, but was hot, which was what mattered. On Friday night, Tex came. He had brought a paperback Western from the rack at the hospital gift shop because he had not thought to bring one from home, and he settled into the chair and opened it and began to read aloud. He did the voices. He did all of them, the grizzled sheriff, the young deputy, the villain who spoke with an accent of indeterminate origin that became more dramatic with each scene. He was not good at it. He was genuinely entertainingly terrible at it, and Willa, who had been running a low fever and a deep cough all week, began to laugh. She laughed until she coughed. She coughed until the night nurse appeared in the doorway with an expression that moved rapidly from alarm through assessment to reluctant amusement. "Your mother," the nurse said to Tex, "needs to rest, not laugh herself into a respiratory episode." "My apologies," Tex said solemnly. He looked at Willa. "She started it." "I did not start it," Willa said, still coughing, still laughing, eyes streaming. "You gave a character from New Mexico an accent that sounded like he was from Scotland, by way of rural Alabama. He had a complicated backstory." The nurse looked at both of them. She shook her head and made a note on her clipboard and left. Willa wiped her eyes. She was tired. The laughter had taken something out of her that she didn't have much to spare. But she looked at Tex, this young man with his terrible voices and his earnest foolishness and his absolute presence in the chair beside her, and she felt something that had nothing to do with illness and everything to do with the astonishing improbability of the life she was living. "Read me another chapter," she said. He read her 2 more chapters. By the end of the second, she was asleep. He kept reading anyway, just in case. Ridge came Saturday morning and sat with her while the doctor did rounds and the nurses did their rotations, and the hospital went about the business of trying to make people well. He brought nothing to read and nothing to do. He sat in the chair, and he was there, which was more than enough. At some point mid-morning, one of the nurses, a young woman named June, who had only been on the floor for a few months, stopped in the doorway and looked at Ridge, and then at Willa, and then back at Ridge. "She's lucky to have you," June said. Ridge looked at her. He looked at Willa, who was sleeping with the particular determination of someone who had decided she was going to get well by the force of her own will and was getting started on it. "Other way around," Ridge said. It was the most words he had spoken all morning. June thought about them for the rest of her shift. The doctors said a week. Willa made it 8 days before she told Dr. Voss with complete clarity and considerable firmness that she was going home. Dr. Voss reviewed her chart, listened to her lungs, and said that her lungs were clear enough to continue recovery at home, provided she rested and took her medications and had someone with her. Willa said she had 6 someones. Dr. Voss said that sounded like more than enough. They were all waiting when Deacon's truck pulled into the driveway on a Sunday afternoon. All 6 of them. Colt on the porch steps, Brick near the door, Tex and Ridge at the edge of the driveway. Slade coming out through the front door with a dish towel over his shoulder because he had been in the kitchen and had not quite made it outside in time. The house was warm. Slade had made soup, the same one Willa had made for Colt the night after Miriam had first come to the house, because he had asked Willa for the recipe the week before she went to the hospital and had written it down on a piece of paper that he kept in his jacket pocket. On the kitchen table, there was a single sunflower in a glass of water. Nobody mentioned who had put it there. Nobody needed to. Willa came up the porch steps with Deacon's arm for balance and Colt's hand waiting at the top, and she stopped on the new porch boards and looked at these men, her men arranged around her house in the gray December light. "I asked for 1 son for a day," she said. Her voice was rough from the cough, but it was clear. "I didn't expect 6 for life." Colt's throat moved. His eyes were wet, and he didn't care. Moose looked at the siren. Deacon cleaned his glasses. Tex bit his lip. Slade looked at his boots. Ridge bowed his head. "We protect our supply of lemon cake," Ma, Colt said. His voice was rough at the edges. She smiled. That smile, the one that had survived Earl's death and Ruth's death and Preston's betrayal and a fall on a kitchen floor and 8 days in a hospital bed. The one that refused, absolutely refused to surrender. "Come inside," she said. "I'm not having my boys standing in the cold." They came inside. The soup was good. The sunflower stood in its glass. The house held them all. Bet Saylor went back to school that fall. Night classes at the community college. Social work. She told Colt about it on a Thursday at Milford's over the usual coffee, and he looked at her for a moment and said, "You know, this was always in you. School just gives you the license." She did not know what to say to that, so she refilled his coffee and went back to the counter and spent the rest of her shift thinking about it. She graduated 3 years later on a Saturday afternoon in May. Willa came. She sat in the front row of the community college auditorium in her good blue cardigan with Slade on one side and Brick on the other. And when Bet's name was called and Bet crossed the stage, Willa stood up. She stood up with her cane and Slade's arm for balance, and she applauded louder and longer than anyone else in that auditorium. And she was still applauding when Bet had already taken her diploma and walked off the other side of the stage and had to stop and turn around to see where the sound was coming from. She went to work for Adult Protective Services. Gerald Marsh was her supervisor. She sat at the desk 2 rows over from his, and she answered the phone, and she listened to the people on the other end of it, the way she had always listened to people, with her whole attention, with the part of herself that noticed things, with the understanding that the difference between a person being heard and a person not being heard was sometimes everything. Some things come full circle. Some circles take years. In the 5th year after the Thursday at Milford's Diner, Willa Greer turned 91 years old on a Tuesday in June. She woke to the sound of someone in her kitchen. This was no longer unusual. Slade was always up before her, and the sounds of another person moving around in a house she had lived alone in for 17 years had taken some getting used to and was now simply the sound of morning, the sound of not being alone, the sound of 2 toothbrushes in a cup. She went downstairs. The kitchen was full. Colt was at the table with a cup of coffee he had made himself, because he had been making his own coffee in this kitchen for 2 years now and knew where everything was. Brick was standing near the back door, too large for the space in the way. He was always too large for spaces, with a wooden chair under one arm that he had built himself over the winter, white and solid, with armrests worn smooth. He had made it for Willa. He had spent 3 months making it in the evenings in his garage, and he had not told anyone he was doing it. Deacon had brought flowers from the nursery in Helena. He set them on the counter and stepped back and looked at them and moved them 2 inches to the left and seemed satisfied. Tex had attempted to bake a cake. The evidence of this attempt was visible on his face, his shirt, and the container he was carrying, which had the approximate appearance of something that had made a decision it regretted. Slade, who had seen the cake in the making, had quietly driven to the bakery in town at 6 that morning and returned with a white box tied in blue ribbon, which he had placed on the counter without comment. Ridge was on the porch. When Willa opened the back door to look, he turned around. He looked at her for a moment with the particular steadiness that had always been his way, the economy of a man who does not perform what he feels but simply feels it fully without announcement. "Happy birthday," he said. 2 words. "Exactly enough. Come inside," Willa said. "All of you. I'm not having my boys standing in the cold." They came inside. The kitchen was not built for this many people, and it had never mattered. Brick sat in the new chair he had brought, which fit him. Deacon sat across from Colt. Tex sat on the counter until Willa told him not to, then sat on a kitchen chair instead. Slade leaned against the wall near the back window the way he always did. Ridge stood. He was most comfortable standing. Willa had stopped trying to seat him. She looked at them. These 6 men, these men who had been strangers on a Thursday morning and had become, through a series of choices made rapidly and without hesitation in a diner on Route 9, the fixed points of her life. She thought about the woman she had been the morning she had walked across that diner. The woman with shaking hands and a purse held to her chest like a shield, and a question that had cost her everything she had to ask. She thought about the moment before she asked it, the moment she had stood at the end of that booth and looked at Colt Maddox's face and thought, "I am about to do something that is either very brave or very stupid," and done it anyway. She had not known in that moment that she was asking for 6 sons. She had not known she was asking for Brick to build her a chair over a winter's worth of evenings. She had not known she was asking for Slade to put his boots by her back door. She had not known she was asking for Deacon to drive her to a doctor who would spend 2 hours seeing her the way a doctor is supposed to see a patient, as a person rather than a conclusion. She had not known she was asking for Tex to ruin a cake at 6 in the morning, Out of love? Or for Ridge to say exactly 2 words and mean a symphony? She had not known she was asking for all of them to sit in shifts through 8 nights in a hospital room keeping watch. She had only known that she needed someone to stand beside her and say that she was not alone. And they had done that. And then they had kept doing it. And then they had kept doing it after that, and through the fall, and the winter, and the spring, and the years that followed. She had asked for one son for one day. She had gotten 6. For life. I need to say something, Willa said. The kitchen went quiet. It went quiet the way the diner had gone quiet years ago, attentive and complete. I know what I looked like that morning, she said. Walking across that diner, a little old woman with a purse and a question nobody was expecting. I know what the odds were that any of you would say yes, she paused. I know what you gave up to keep saying yes. Thursday after Thursday, year after year, 100 small things and some things that were not small at all. She looked at each of them, unhurried, fully. Earl built this house, she said. He built every inch of it. But a house is not what makes a home. I know that now better than I have ever known it. A home is the people in it who chose to be there. She stopped. She pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was keeping something in that needed a moment before it could be said properly. You chose to be here, every one of you, and I would like you to know that it has been the great gift of the last 5 years of my life. Nobody spoke. Colt looked at the table, then at the wall, then at Willa with eyes that were wet and made no attempt to be otherwise. Brick examined the flowers Deacon had brought with intense and sudden interest. Deacon cleaned his glasses for the 3rd time that morning. Tex bit the inside of his cheek and looked at the ceiling. Slade looked at his boots. Ridge bowed his head. Now Willa said in a different tone, entirely the tone she used when sentiment had been given its proper moment, and it was time to be practical. Someone is going to tell me what is in that white bakery box, and someone else is going to explain to me why Tex is covered in what I can only assume is cake batter, and then we are going to have breakfast. The kitchen hum alive again. Tex began explaining himself in a way that explained nothing. Brick laughed a low sound like something rolling over good ground. Deacon retrieved plates from the cabinet, the ones with the blue flowers around the edges, that Willa had started using again 3 years ago after Slade had moved in, because she had decided that good plates were for every day and not for occasions, because every day was an occasion if you paid enough attention. Colt stood up and poured more coffee, without being asked for everyone the way he had been doing since the first morning. He understood that this was his kitchen too. Willa sat at the head of the table. At the table Earl had built in 1963. In the house Earl had built in 1963. In the kitchen where she had stood alone for 17 years and where she was not alone, now would not be alone again, had chosen not to be alone, and had been met in that choice by people who chose the same. Outside, the June morning was coming up gold over the mountains. The pine trees along the east fence stood tall and unchanged, patient as they had always been, holding their ground the same way they had held it for 60 years against every wind that had come off the Rockies. Earl had planted them because she was cold. She was not cold anymore. Tex made a joke that nobody laughed at. Slade reached across the table without looking and set the salt shaker upright before it finished falling. Ridge caught Willa's eye from across the kitchen, and the smallest imaginable thing crossed his face. Something that was not quite a smile, but was the shape of one, the outline of one, which from Ridge was as warm as a laugh from anyone else. Willa Greer picked up her fork. She thought about what she had said to Colt on the porch that night 5 years ago, after he had told her about his mother. You couldn't save her, but you're saving me. And maybe that's the same thing. She thought about the woman in the diner, the shaking hands, the purse held like a shield, the 7 words that had cost everything and changed everything. She thought about Bet at her desk, 2 rows from Gerald's, answering a phone, listening with her whole self to whoever was on the other end. She thought about the 7 people Stanton had evaluated, the ones who had lost their homes before anyone had looked under the hood. She thought about them the way Colt thought about his mother, with the particular grief of the thing you cannot undo, and with the particular resolve that comes from understanding that the only response to what cannot be undone is to work without stopping on everything that still can be. She thought about what it meant that a waitress had listened, and a biker had moved, and a lawyer had driven 200 miles, and a caseworker had read a report 3 times, and an old woman had walked across a diner with shaking hands and asked a question nobody expected. She thought about how none of them had authority. None of them had power, not in the way that power is usually meant. None of them had a badge or a title or a system behind them when it mattered most. They had only the willingness to hear something and then to stand up. That was all it had taken. That was everything it had taken. Colt set a second cup of coffee in front of her without being asked the way he always did. She looked up at him. He looked back at her, this man, this 62-year-old road-worn man with his gray beard and his scarred hands, in the particular steadiness in his eyes that had been there from the first moment she had looked into them across a diner booth when she had had nothing left but a question and the terrifying hope that strangers might be kinder than family. "Happy birthday, Ma," he said. Outside, the pine trees stood where Earl had put them. The morning came up gold. And somewhere in whatever place holds the things we lose and the things we find, two mothers looked at each other and nodded. And a dead older than leather and steel and all the roads in Montana finally quietly came to rest.